One of the people that I reached out to today to come and speak was Dr. Adrian Moore from the Reason Foundation. When we had our very first conference, we had it here, and we had a representative from Reason. And we really, really enjoy the relationship that we have with Reason. And Dr. Moore, thank you for your help in advertising. I really appreciate you putting it out there for the conference and to encourage people to come. Thank you. He is the Vice President of Policy at Reason, and he leads Reason's policy implementation efforts and conducts his own research on topics such as privatization, government and regulatory reform, air quality, transportation, urban growth, prisons, and utilities. Dr. Moore has also testified before Congress on several occasions and regularly advises federal, state, and local officials on way to streamline government and reduce costs. I was so pleased when I reached out to him and he agreed to be able to join us today. Ladies and gentlemen, our keynote speaker, Dr. Adrian Moore.
Thanks, everybody. You know, one thing about working, my part of the work at Reason, you know, most of you probably know Reason from the journalism, right? It's from the magazine, if you're over 40 and initially, and then the website, and now Reason TV. That is the preponderance of Reason's works. What Ernie was talking about, the culture war, trying to convince more people to want to be free, has got to happen before anything's really going to change. But Reason's also always had sort of a smaller part of the operation is trying to say, well, at least when there is somebody in government who appears to want to do something right, you know, maybe it would be nice if they could get a little help, you know, and some advice on how to do it, and occasionally it actually works. But that's always been sort of my specialty. And the depressing thing about that is I spend almost all my time working with people in government. And one thing you learn working with people in government is it doesn't matter what their philosophy is, really, in the long run. Everything the government touches goes to crap. It's just all there is to it. It's just a god-awful force for evil. People always talk about the sausage factory, right? Like, you know, you don't want to see sausage being made, and you don't want to see legislation being made. Well, I've been to sausage factories, and they're stinky, messy, nasty places. But at the end, you have sausage. Damn, it's good. You eat it, it's delicious. What do you have at the end of legislation, the legislative process? You got a stinking law, okay? Another screw job, basically. Another thing you can't do. Another thing they're going to make, another thing you want to do that you can't, or another thing you don't want to do that they're going to make you do. So to me, there's no comparison. I'll take a sausage factory on every corner before I'll take one legislator. So I've seen, I was thinking, as I was thinking about putting this talk together, I thought of all the things, I made kind of a list of things I could talk about. And I wound up deciding to kind of do a good news, bad news kind of approach. So I have a list of things, and I'll go through as many as I have time to go through and try to alternate a little bit. But I was also thinking about, like, what's the stupidest government trick I've seen? Because that's how I describe, like, my day-to-day life is, like, I'm watching some other stupid government trick happening. And this is my favorite one. I call this the dam story. So there was this dam. It's built some time ago to provide water for this town. Well, it's kind of obsolete now. They dug some wells, and they don't need the water from behind the dam anymore. So the Public Utilities Commission tells the private company that owns this dam, the private water company, you know, you built this dam back before World War II, and now the doggone thing is seismically unsafe. It's got to go. People live downstream from the dam. If that thing cracks, and I visited the dam, it looks a little shaky. If that thing goes down, then people are going to die. So you have to tear the dam down. And the private company's like, we have no problem with tearing the dam down as long as the regulators, will allow us to do it in some kind of economically feasible way. In other words, we've got to have a way to pay for it, which that's allegedly what the Public Utilities Commission is supposed to do, is manage that process. So no sooner do they start the process of figuring out how do we tear down this dam when up pops the Department of Fish and Game to say, hey, you've got to tear down this dam because that dam has been blocking, since before World War II, the migration of steelhead trout up this river. And yeah, we know we've been forcing you for decades to, no kidding, catch the steelhead, put them in a truck, drive them up above the dam, and dump them in the lake above the dam. So they've got a ferry, a truck service for steelhead. Never mind you've been doing that. Now we've decided that's no longer sufficient. You have to tear down this dam. And the company said, well, the good news is we already have to tear down the dam because it's going to fall down. So, okay, no problem. And they say, yeah, but we're going to sue you anyway because we're worried that you might, backslide and not tear down the dam. So here's your papers. We're suing you to tear down the dam. And they're like, we're in the middle of a process to tear down the dam. Really? Okay, fine. The next day, EPA shows up. EPA says, we're suing you. Here's the paperwork. You can't tear down the dam. I'm like, why can't we tear it down? Because the silted up area above the dam that's filled in as the river has brought all that silt in and filled in more than half the lake is now habitat for the endangered red-legged tree frog. If you tear it down, the river's going to wash away all that habitat, and they're endangered. You can't do that. And they said, well, okay, I guess we can kind of understand that. But here, EPA and Fish and Game, why don't you guys get together and figure out a solution that's going to work? And they're like, no, that's not our job. Our job is to sue you for the endangered tree frogs. Their job is to sue you for the salmon, and you just have to, saw yourself in half or whatever. Not our problem. And this went on and on. I mean, literally, that was their official position. I went and met with these people. I'm like, seriously, we can't, work something out here? No, absolutely not. That would compromise our, I don't think any of them actually had the gall to say principles, but that was the general thrust of what they were trying to say is we have our writ of mandate, and it is to force these people to do this, no matter how irrational. And, go to the governor's office and say, look, you're supposedly the boss of these people. Can't you, knock their heads together and make something happen? No, we'd get sued. So the environmental groups, of course, on both sides are like, well, no, if either of these agencies backslides, we're going to jump in with lawsuits. So, I just said, well, sounds like good time to move to Costa Rica. If I was the private water company CEO, I'd just take off, So, and they were in this legal bind for many, many years. Eventually, ultimately, a judge had to sort it all out. So at least that part of the system did work where they are going to be allowed to tear down the dam. Only they're going to have to now force the owners, the customers of that system are going to have to pay some god-awful amount of money to mitigate that red-legged tree frog habitat. But nothing can be so irrational. I explained this to my 8-year-old daughter. She's like, "What are you talking about?" I'm like, "Seriously, this doesn't even pass the 8-year-old test, and yet I've got people from the governor's office saying makes perfect sense to me." So it doesn't get much stupider than government. So when I think about, so there really is no way, there's no way out of the pickle of lessening freedom that we're increasingly in other than for government, for there to be a whole lot less government, right? But there's the chicken and egg problem, right? How do you have less government? You can only get less government if people want less government, but they're all trapped in their day-to-day lives of getting on, and nobody's really moved to jump, take that step into sort of the dark and say, okay, we'll just let the government quit doing this thing and trust that we can work that out. And that's really, to me, I've always thought that the operational part of what Ernie was talking about, that sort of, when you get everybody marching down the hallways chanting freedom, that's great. That means they want it. But then the actual, in the morning when they wake up, so to speak, it's like, okay, well, you know what the flip side of freedom is? It's responsibility. That means if the government's not going to pick your medicine for you, you're going to have to get off your ass and do it yourself. Well, people don't want to get off their ass and do it themselves, and that's still the problem. People increasingly on the upside want the freedom. They increasingly don't want the responsibility. I mean, it seems very divergent. It seems like every time I look at polls in the news and talk to students and so forth, I'm like, wow, there's a real gap here. They want more freedom, but they don't want more responsibility, and they haven't realized that that you can't have it that way. So work to be done, no surprise. But I was looking at some things, so going back to my sort of pro and con or good news, bad news sort of format. So Gallup does this very frequent series of polls, and one of the things they do poll every few weeks on is, what do you think are the biggest problems that we face in the U.S.? And since October, the number one of the most important U.S. problems has been the government. So I say that's great. Okay, 33% of the people in October said that the government was the biggest problem the U.S. faces. That's tapered down slowly since then. So in October, people were really fired up. As of a couple of days ago, it was at 21%. But that's still the most popular choice, followed by 18% said the economy in general, 16% said unemployment, 16% said health care, and 8% said the federal budget and debt. But really, health care and the federal budget and debt are just another version of the government being the problem. So in effect, still about half the people are saying government is the biggest problem we face. The fastest rising, when you look at the trend line on all of those things, the one that's going up and has been going up steadily for months now is healthcare, is Obamacare. So people, it's quite conceivable it could become the number one concern here in the next, in a couple of polls from now, because more and more people are realizing what a bad idea this thing has turned out to be. Now, interestingly, at the bottom, out of all the choices they give people to select as what they think is the number one, the ones that are just dead bottom are welfare, immigration, and the wealth gap. So even though the media can't go a day without 100 stories, looking at Twitter, it's a Saturday, and there's all these stories on Twitter about, income inequality, right? It's the biggest thing in media these days. Well, according to Gallup, people don't give a flying hoot about that. Maybe there's good news that the media doesn't completely control people's opinions. A more mixed, an area of sort of a mixture of progress and regression, I think, is the war on drugs. You can't help but be somewhat encouraged by Colorado and Washington and the vote this last week in New Hampshire. In the New Hampshire legislature to legalize marijuana, and the District of Columbia looking at legalizing medical marijuana. I mean, these are all, in the big scheme of things, relatively small steps, but after, most of my life, that being nothing but an unrelenting expansion of the war on drugs, anything that shows that more and more people are starting to say, wait a minute, this doesn't make any cotton picking sense, is, I think, a really big turnaround. And again, you see this in polls. More and more people really are saying, at sort of the extreme level, look, I've just plain figured out that pot's not a big deal, and we need to quit. We need to quit with all this nonsense. To other people just saying, well, look, I still have, personally a big problem with pot, but the war on drugs is a debacle. no other way around it. And so I'm just no longer down on the war on drugs. Well, I don't personally, I think in terms of the culture war, we need to get more people into that first group. But ultimately, it doesn't matter. If whatever moral qualms you have with any behavior, if you're willing to have your moral qualms and not force other people to live according to it, have at it. That's the whole point. The flip side of that is, the nannies, and I find myself wanting to say the nanny government because, of course, that's when it really gets in your face. But the fact is, nanny government is fueled by nanny activists. There's a gazillions of activist groups out there whose energy, all the fervor you guys put into liberty. There's groups just like this meeting in a place just like this to talk about what are we going to do to get the cotton-picking e-cigarettes out of these people's hands or whatever their thing is. Or, I was just reading yesterday. Do you know that there are people where places you can go and pay money and cuddle, and that's a gateway to prostitution? We've got to put a stop to this. Let's march. Let's get petition. All the same stuff we do to try to get more free, these people are doing to try to, stop people from doing something they don't like. And so that nanny, we need to become activists in order to get out there and stop people from doing something we don't like is far too alive and well out there. Watching I mentioned the e-cigarettes. Watching that play out in the last few weeks has just been unreal, where you literally have governments and prominent public personas saying, look, we understand that e-cigarettes are just vapor, right? You got nicotine and water vapor. Okay, so there's nothing in there, none of the carcinogens from cigarettes are in those things, but it looks like smoking, and therefore we have to ban it because it's, So, you know what? It's only a matter of time before making this gesture is against the law because it looks like I'm smoking an invisible cigarette. No smoking invisible cigarettes. Yeah. It just, oh, well, yeah, that's right. They've already banned this. Boy, don't do that in school or you're out, right? Good point, right? So gestures that are evocative of things that we don't like become banned. So, I try to reconcile that. I'm like, wow, what is going on with this wacky country we live in where, far too many people are perfectly fine with throwing kids out of school for going like this, or banning people from huffing water vapor because it looks somewhat like smoking. And it doesn't even look that much like smoking if you don't want it to. I mean, you can have an e-cigarette that looks like a cigarette and acts like a cigarette, or you can have something that doesn't look very much like an e-cigarette, looks more like a lightsaber or whatever, I mean, it doesn't have to really be that evocative of smoking, but it doesn't matter. We have a tension here in the culture where there's still, still some work to do. I'm loving the growing movement to surveil the police. There's a million people doing this. I mean, it's surprising. I kind of keep stumbling across new activists or groups out there that are doing things to do with, recording government in action. I said surveil the police. That's maybe the pointy end of it, but what I really mean is, look, the more of that record we keep of what politicians say, and more importantly now, I think, what government is doing. Whenever things are going on, whenever the government is doing things, if we're videotaping it, we're creating records. And of course they hate that. And nobody hates it more in government than the police. And there's a group down in Florida that I follow called Photography is Not a Crime. And all they do is go make public records requests and videotape the whole process and go to different agencies and try to figure out who's actually tolerant of public records requests and who's not, and who's respects public information and who doesn't respect public information. But the side effect of that has been figuring out, well, who also comes and grabs your camera away from you and deletes it or what have you. So the recording and videotaping of police is in more and more states is forcing a reckoning with accountability, and increasingly, I think, forcing police to recognize that what they do is not private, which is what they've argued, which is just mind-boggling when you think about it, but that it's public and therefore subject to being recorded and on the record. And if we get to the point where that's relatively ubiquitous, it's going to really change the balance of power, because right now, obviously, the balance of power is completely in the favor of law enforcement. So when it's their word against yours, your word is not worth spit. On the other hand, drones. Now, a lot we could say about drones. I was thinking about, well, what's something I've seen or heard about drones recently that you might know? And I found a survey that was done with local government officials, asking them. It explained sort of the state of drone technology. It was an article followed by a survey, and what drones can and can't do, which is kind of useful because there's a lot of myths out there about what drones can and can't do. But then they had a survey that said, what do you think is a good use of drones by the government. And local government officials think everything is a good use of drones. The only thing on the entire list that less than 50% voted for, not 0%, but less than 50% only voted for one thing, and that was constant 24-hour surveillance of the entire city. That was the only, they're like, nah, we'll draw the line. 40% of them said, we'll draw the line at that. No. All the rest of them were like, hell yeah. And everything else you could think of. I was like, wow. I mean, I did not expect that. I thought, search and rescue, helping an active police pursuit, some of those things might be pretty popular with those guys, but they were like, nah, everything you can think of having a drone do is an awesome idea to the average local government official. So, rural, Midwestern, Republican, Democrat, doesn't matter. They love it if it gives them more power. Somebody mentioned, I think actually it's come up twice now, in the context of End the Fed, the growing popularity of that basic idea among young people is probably the number one thing. But the number two thing is the technology in the form of all kinds of things, of which Bitcoin is the one that most people have heard of. But the reality that the control over the money is slowly slipping through their fingers. It's got a ways to go. I mean, there's a lot of weapons at the system's disposal to keep control over the money supply. But it's leaking, and it's leaking big time. And when some place like Overstock starts taking Bitcoin, last time Reason, just a few weeks ago, Reason had a big online fundraising drive. And we got a lot of donations in Bitcoins. It was pretty cool. And so we're, of course there was the accountant is like, well, let's cash these things for money because, he's doing the accounting. And we're going, no, let's figure out what can we spend them on? What services that Reason purchases can we purchase with Bitcoins? That's going to be really fun. Let's, try to make that part of our actual flow of funds. So we're exploring that. But so undermining that most, I don't know, is the power to manipulate the money supply more or less intrusive than their power to take whatever percentage of our money they want? I have a hard time deciding on that one. I don't know. I think we're sort of getting the dirty end of the stick on either one. Their power to tax and the ways in which they've hidden their power to tax and their power to spend. Basically, creating obligations that they won't have to pay, but that future generations will have to pay. And there's many versions of this. There's the federal debt. There's Social Security. There's all these sorts of things. And more recently, at the local and state level, there is the outrageous pension and health care benefits that are promised to government workers in year after year of quietly negotiated without any public oversight. Because, well, heck, it was our elected officials sitting down with the union officials to negotiate those labor contracts. How democratic can you get? Well, gee, the vast majority of people who don't ever have to hang out with city council members or county supervisors or state legislators, and it's sort of a day-to-day basis, and see how they view themselves with respect to government workers versus us, they're far closer to those government workers than they will ever be to the average Joe in their district. And so no surprise, those negotiations weren't quite as adversarial as they always described them to be. And they made a lot of sweetheart deals, and all of the bills were due 5, 10, 20 years down the road, so it was great. It's a great way to hide. They're essentially raising our future taxes, making binding legal agreements that force us to raise taxes in the future, and we don't even know about it, let alone getting a chance to vote on it. It's a great racket. Fortunately, some of that's unwinding. We'll see what ultimately happens. I mean, San Diego and San Jose actually were able to get a popular vote. Some other places are going to be voting on unwinding these things. Other places like San Bernardino, we'll see what happens with what ultimately comes out of the bankruptcy courts there. But Desert Hot Springs, and on it goes. I mean, there's an amazing number of places that are going financially upside down. That kind of, these people in local government in particular only do the right thing usually when they're backed up against the wall. And the inability to pay those pension obligations, the payments they have to make, is the only thing that's really forcing this. It's only going bankrupt or nearly going bankrupt that's forcing them. So, if that's what it takes, I guess that's what it takes. We'll have to see if out of that can actually come some real limitations on their power, or if it's just going to be a temporary renegotiation of debt. I'd love to see places like San Bernardino actually really fundamentally reform their charter in a way that just plain doesn't allow the politicians anything remotely like those kind of powers. Be a good start. So I'm thinking about California. I've got a friend down in San Diego named Richard Ryder. He's a tax activist, and one of the things he does a great job of keeping track of all the ways that California sucks. And it's a long list. So just to hit a few of them, we have the highest state income tax rate. We have the highest sales tax in the nation. The impact fees to build a house or an apartment in California are 2 times the next highest state. So not only are we number one, we're number one squared on impact fees. I mean, it's just ridiculous. We have the 3rd worst business climate in the nation. The American Tort Reform Association has 2 years in a row named California the worst judicial hellhole in the United States. We license more occupations, the state licenses more occupations than any other state in the nation. In other words, you have to pay the monopoly if you want. No, that's not even true. Most of the time, you can't pay a monopoly to enter that business. You just can't enter that business. I've done a lot of expert witness work in that particular area with Pacific Legal Foundation, and it's just amazing how many of these systems are set up where we did one where we were able to document 28 people had applied for licenses in 5 years. 0 had been given a license, but they were following the process. California has, and this is a statistic that's been around for a while, California has 12% of the nation's population, but 33% of the nation's welfare recipients, because we didn't want to play welfare reform. And that's just the start of the list. So California is the flagship for the the blue state model. The government will take care of everything for you. And by the way, you think this is your property, as Ernest said? No. You can't drink the soda you want. You can't have the chemicals you want. As the Center for Disease Control has said, if you're smoking an electronic cigarette, there's atoms and molecules in there, and we don't know what they do. So you can't do that. Talk about taking the precautionary principle to the extreme. Literally, we know exactly what's in that stuff. There's nothing in there that's harmful, but it doesn't matter because we can theorize that it could be possible for there to be some atoms or molecules in there. I guess there would be both, wouldn't there? That could be harmful at some level, and therefore we're going to prevent you from doing it now on the off chance that our future research ever discovers anything wrong with it. This is how they think about it. It's, your body is not your temple. So just to the California, of course, being the first to seize upon banning electronic cigarettes, banning styrofoam cups, banning plastic bags, banning pet shops, banning cuddling. You name it, it got banned here first. And people point to Bloomberg in New York because he was such a banner. I mean, he loved it. He did it all the time. He got a lot of news. He's the mayor of New York, but he was a piker compared to California. Most of the stuff he did, he was copying California, just he got better press. It's amazing, and it's interesting. I've lived in California my whole life. The only time in my life I didn't live in California was when I was in the military, and they sent me other places. And but this June, I'm actually moving to Florida because I can save $20,000 a year by moving to Florida. It'd be insane for me not to. Not only that, but my kids' college is going to be vastly cheaper. We started pricing college. My oldest is 1 year away from starting college, so she's shopping at colleges. I'm a very, very slightly disabled veteran. According to California law, this is genius. So California, lots of states have rules that say the kids of disabled veterans don't have to pay tuition at the public schools. Every other state but California, it's like you've got to be disabled, like in a wheelchair, not able to work, disabled. Well, we'll give your kids a shot by giving them tuition-free public college, right? Okay. California says, no, it doesn't matter. I've got varicose veins. My kids get free college. You know, it's ridiculous, right? Even if I was going to take that benefit and have my daughter not pay tuition in California, it's still much more expensive to go to college here than in Texas or Florida or Virginia or Ohio. This place has gone insane. The uphill battle we have to do in California is pretty mind-boggling. So there's a lot of good news and a lot of things are moving the right way, but the hill we've got to push that boulder up is mighty big in California. So it's a good thing people are fired up because we've got I know we're not all going to be as free as we want to be by the time I die, and I'm hoping my kids are pretty fired up. I think they'll carry on the fight. And I think we all have to recognize it's not only our lifetimes, it's our kids' lifetimes that this fight has to go on, and just keep pushing that rock up the hill. Thanks.
How great was he? Pretty great, right? Thank you again, Dr. Moore, for coming. We appreciate having you.